In the South, Jefferson Davis, who was president of the Confederacy, was tasked with rallying public support for the Confederacy. But he was not really able to message the meaning of the war in the way that Lincoln was in the North. The lack of a party system in the South also made it harder to message. In the North, Democratic dissent allowed for Republicans to organize their messaging around Lincoln. But in the South, the Confederate government was far more centralized than the Old South had ever been before. So they failed to find a way to utilize their most important economic resource, which was cotton. They tried to suppress cotton production in order to force Great Britain to intervene on the side of the Confederacy, but it was ineffective. Britain was just as reliant on the North for wheat. And other nations expanded their production of cotton because of the overdependence on Southern cotton. And this actually led to a worldwide crisis of overproduction, where cotton was worth hardly anything. And in the South, Southerners are increasingly divided over issues like the draft. This war was fought on the backs of those who didn't even own slaves to protect the institution of slavery. If you've ever heard the term a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, is never as true as it is for the South in the Civil War. And as the blockade tightened and parts of the Confederacy came under Union control, production by slaves declined, and we had shortages of basic foodstuffs like salt, corn, and meat, which leads to a lot of other economic problems. The war left countless farms, plantations, businesses, and railroads in ruins. Confederate policies actually exaggerated these problems rather than helping them. It did not place the burdens of the war on citizens equally. Non-slaveholders felt that they were bearing an unfair share of the burden of the war. The Confederacy also had to borrow heavily to finance the war, and they refused to place taxes on large landowners. The Confederacy also authorized military officers to seize farm goods to supply the army and paid for it with useless Confederate money that was known as impressment. Desertion happened a lot, especially among the poorest Southerners whose own labor was needed to feed their own families and not to fight in the war. By 1864, you have an organized peace movement known as Southern Unionists that appear in several Southern states. These were secret societies that were promoting frustration with the war effort. Some of these Southern Unionists actually fought in the Union Army. There's also more of a burden placed on Southern women than Northern women. Many Southern women were left alone on farms and plantations and had to manage and discipline things that had been previously placed in men's realms. But women did mobilize support for soldiers in the field, and some even worked in factories, especially in urban centers like Richmond. But the growing frustrations of Southern women contributed to a decline of Southern morale in general. A shortage of white manpower eventually led Confederate authorities to authorize arming slaves to fight for the South. Many slaveholders fiercely resisted this, and initially the Confederate Senate voted against it, but it was finally endorsed in March 1865. But the war ended before recruitment actually began. The Confederate Army did employ blacks, mainly slaves, as laborers throughout the war effort. Despite declining morale and the demise of slavery, the outcome of this war was not very clear in 1863 to 1864. One major turning point in the war, especially the war in the North, was the Battle of Gettysburg. General Lee planned to invade the North, and that plan was going to happen at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, as you can see on this map. The Battle of Gettysburg was fighting for 3 days, and it's the largest battle that's ever been fought in North America. Lee and the Confederate Army ended up retreating, and as they retreated, they never set foot on Northern soil again. The turning point in the West was the Battle of Vicksburg, which was in Mississippi, and this place, as you can see on the map, was very important. It was a very strategic location that was important for the control of the Mississippi River. The Union won this war with the leadership of Ulysses S. Grant and won control over the Mississippi River. These two battles together dealt a heavy blow to Southern morale. By 1864, we have a war of attrition. Grant became the general in the East and started this war of attrition against Lee's forces. A war of attrition basically means that you are willing to accept high numbers of casualty, knowing that you can replace your men while the other side can't. And so Grant starts this war of attrition because he knows that the North can replace soldiers and that the South can't. And so what Grant does is he continuously attacks along the line, which would be the front lines of battle, and preventing the army from retreating. So as the Southern army would retreat, they would just follow them and continue making attacks. Because of this type of strategy, Grant becomes known as a butcher of men. Meanwhile, General Sherman in the South moved his forces from Tennessee to Georgia. But they met a lot of resistance until they captured Atlanta. After they captured Atlanta, they didn't have as much resistance. Northern morale was actually sinking to its lowest point in September of 1864 after these sustained casualties of the previous year. After capturing Atlanta, General Sherman and his army completed a march to the sea, where he cut through Georgia, destroyed railroads, buildings, food and supplies that couldn't be used, basically destroyed everything that they could find. Very few civilians were harmed, but it really destroyed a lot of the countryside in Georgia. And after capturing Savannah, Sherman moved north towards South Carolina, continuing his war of destruction. In January of 1865, Congress passes the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery throughout the entire country. By April of 1865, Grant's war of attrition was completed as he broke through Lee's line and captured Richmond, which was the Confederacy's capital. Eventually, he was able to surround Lee's troops and force them to surrender. Lee officially surrendered on April 9th of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Just 5 days later, Lincoln was assassinated at a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington. And his death not only was sad because he was the leader of this war and only saw the victory for 5 days, but it will have major implications in the Reconstruction period to follow.